This is the 10-hour topic, motor learning processes, and the attentional control C.2.2. That's 2 hours. So that's 12 hours in, I don't know how long this video is going to be. Let's go. So we start with skills and abilities. Skill can be learned and improved via practice. There's 4 types: motor skills, movement skills, um, cognitive skills. So these require you to think. They're related to the mind. Example of this is strategies. Perceptual, these are your senses. And perceptual motors, sensing something and reacting with a movement. Now, abilities are physical and genetic. They can be improved, but genetics play a big role. Let's talk about rate of learning, which is impacted by the following factors. There's the physical maturation of the athlete's motivation, and fitness levels. Types of learning transfer. So we've got positive learning transfer, where practice of a task helps in another. So if you're kicking a lot of football, the muscle memory you're going to learn and everything else is going to help you in kickboxing, and vice versa. Negative transfer. So this is when you practice one thing and make another thing harder. So if you do a lot of football, you're running a lot, you don't have that much size, well, that's going to help you in weightlifting. You're going to lift less weight. And neutral, where the practice of one sport is relevant for another. So being good at football or worse doesn't make you better or worse at bowling. Now, let's look at this man right here. His name is Kerr, and he states that performance is temporary and fluctuates, while learning is a relatively permanent change in performance. Let's look at the 3 stages of learning. This is part of linear pedagogy. So there's the cognitive stage. It requires you to think. Remember, cognitive skills, thinking. So you're going to need a lot of coaching, thinking. It's going to be awkward. You're going to do things step by step. Associative, this is when you kind of know what to do, but you still need help. And autonomous, where everything's smooth. You'll see this in professionals. You don't need coaching and thinking. Let's compare linear pedagogy and nonlinear pedagogy. Remember, pedagogy means teaching. So linear is going to be a more teacher-centered approach. Okay, if we compare it with the learner-centered approach of nonlinear pedagogy, we'll see that this means the athlete is going to be more encouraged to learn by themselves and learn as they go, compared to here, where skills are taught and broken down into smaller steps. And we've got the 3 stages of learning that I've mentioned before. Now, linear pedagogy is based on the information processing model. Let's have a look at it right now. Information processing model. Let's go. So everything starts with a sensation or a stimuli, stimulus, whatever. This is registered into your sensory memory or sensory register, which can be voluntary or involuntary. Okay. Now it's going to have a duration of less than half a second. Next up, we have perception. Okay. This perception involves proprioceptors, interoceptors, such as HR or lung function. Remember, intero, inside. Exteroreceptors, such as vision or audition. Okay, and we can link this to the short-term memory, or STM, because the information is going to travel to our short-term memory. And this is done via selective attention, which can be enhanced by a technique called memory chunking. This is when you chunk information into smaller pieces. That's why phone numbers are like this: 699, 67, oh, hell no, 420 and 21, okay? So we'll see that the information is chunked into smaller pieces. It would be harder to learn this number if it was all together. This is memory chunking. Now, selective attention is reduced by ADHD, or having the syndrome of very short attention span, and selective attention removes useless information. It's going to focus on the information that you want to receive. So in a football game, for example, you'll be ignoring the chants from the crowd, maybe some insults, and you'll be focusing on the game, on the ball, okay? Now there's the long-term memory, okay, or LTM, and information goes from the short-term memory to the long-term memory by rehearsal, and this is called retention, okay? So we're going to retain it into our long-term memory. Now, Getting the information from our long-term memory to our short-term memory is called retrieval. Okay, if you want to remember something from the past, you're going to retrieve it into your short-term memory. Now, the short-term memory has a capacity of 7 plus minus 2. It processes information, and comparing it to the long-term memory, we'll see that's going to store everything that you have ever sensed. While it does store everything you've ever sensed, it doesn't mean you can retrieve everything you've ever sensed. And the capacity of this store is potentially unlimited. Next up, to make a decision, we may process information or retrieve it and then process it, or we may straight up make the decision, okay, during the perception. Now, from that, we move to efferent organization. So you've made the decision, and now remember efferent nervous system, we make our move, we make our response. Exactly. Now, Welford's single channel hypothesis. This is a hypothesis that states we can only process one piece of information at a time. Wickens and the multiple resource theory. We can process more than one piece of information if they are different. For example, running and dribbling simultaneously, or running with the ball while looking out for a teammate at the same time. Continuing with linear pedagogy, we'll see Hicks' law. So if there's choices and there's time, specifically reaction time, okay, we'll see that the more choices we have, the more reaction time we have, and this is called Hicks' law. Now, looking at the psychological refractory period, when two stimuli happen straight in a row, we'll see the following. We'll see that this is the speed of response. These are the two stimuli. For the first stimuli, okay, the response is going to be at this speed, and we compare it to the second stimuli. We'll see that the second stimuli has a slower response, okay, less speed. And this is because response 2 can only happen after you fully process response 1, okay? And so this gap right here is because before response 2 can happen, you're still responding to stimulus 1, if that makes sense. Motor programs, this is part of linear pedagogy as well. They're going to be a series of subroutines organized into the correct sequence to perform a movement, okay? So they can be broken down and stored in the long-term memory and retrieved to the short-term memory when needed. Now, an executive program is a group of motor programs. Generalized motor patterns are the fundamentals, the fundamental movements such as running, kicking, jumping, or throwing, and they serve as basics for subordinate motor patterns, which are the variations of these movements. Okay, so for example, you may turn running into dribbling. You may turn kicking into a specific type of kicking to give the ball in football, for example, a specific spin, such as a trivela, or from jumping to dunking in basketball. Okay, so generalized motor patterns are the fundamentals, they're the basics, and the subordinate motor patterns make the specific variations. And yeah, another example here. Open and closed loop control. So open loop control, okay, an example of this is the motor programs we've seen. It's going to be automatic, fast, such as a quick punch in boxing, okay? So because it's so quick, we're talking milliseconds, there's not going to be any feedback we can use to change our movement, okay? Compare this with closed loop control, where because it's slower, we can change during the execution because we can use feedback. So for example, if you're about to catch a ball, you don't immediately grab the ball, okay? In most cases, if it's coming from afar, you're going to be looking at the ball and adjusting your hand position and your leg position in order to catch it, okay? So the feedback is the movement of the ball coming towards you. Now, in closed loop control, we develop what's called a perceptual trace, which is essentially the memory for the field of past successful movements. If you practice IB psychology, you'll know what a schema is: a mental representation of a situation based on past experiences, and this can apply to sports, especially to movements, okay? And we'll see that schemas retrieve or recall info from the long-term memory to our short-term memory, so they can be used in the moment, okay? And this is called response specification, where we use the following schemas to help us decide a movement and execute it correctly. So to decide what movement we do as a response to a stimulus, we're going to use a recall schema. And to execute the movement smoothly, we're going to use a recognition schema. Feedback can be a great motivator for your athletes, and not praising them, well, it's going to demotivate your athlete. Now, overpraising is not going to be good either, because if you praise someone a lot, the praising loses its value eventually, and so the benefits you could get are no longer present. Now, this links to the cognitive phase or stage of learning, where the coach is going to need prescriptive feedback or give prescriptive feedback to his athlete in order to instruct them, okay? Because we know that in this stage, the athlete is in an awkward position and doesn't really know what to do. Now, in the other two stages, we're going to use repeated knowledge of results, or core, by comparing ourselves to the information in our long-term memory, okay? So remember that we recall information from the long-term memory to the short-term memory. Then that means we can use the schemas. So this basically means that the more experience you have, that's why the smoother things go, because you can recall information and schemas from the long-term memory, all the experience that you have, or the knowledge of results. Now let's change to linear pedagogy based on the ecological dynamics approach and the dynamical systems theory. It's right here. Let's have a look at that as well. It does include this right here, so don't worry. Let's go. I think I just need to delete this. Okay, let's go. The ecological dynamics theory and dynamical systems theory both argue that the body is a complex and adaptable system that self-organizes itself to find effective movement solutions. Let me explain. So, self-organization involves three types of constraint: personal constraints, such as weight, height, cognition. This is your thinking, your mind. Then there's task constraints, such as the rules of the sport, the surface floor in which you're playing in, and whether it's indoors or outdoors. And finally, the environmental constraints. This can be either weather or the audience, for example. Now, as coaches, we can manipulate these to improve the performance of our athletes. For example, in football, you might see training sessions where it's a 2-on-1. There's two attackers and one defender, or two defenders and one attacker. That's manipulating the rules of the sport, the task constraint, in order to train our athletes in a specific way. Now, looking at performance variability. This is essentially how performance varies in different training sessions or different games, okay? And the variability in movements and situations. So if we shoot from a lot of different angles, for example, we create a more adaptable athlete that can, well, shoot from a lot of different angles. And this applies to many other things, such as passing from a different angle or jumping from a different place, okay? Now, degrees of freedom is the number of different movements during a skill, okay? Now, early learners will freeze some movements to learn a skill. So for example, if you're trying to learn a cartwheel, you'll first learn the hand positioning, or you're trying to learn a kick, you'll first learn the hip positioning, stuff like that. So you've probably applied this to your own life as well. Now, perception action coupling is the link between perceiving or sensing stimuli and acting accordingly. I think I've mentioned this before. And because of this, practice should include realistic and information-rich environments that are applicable to real-life gains. If if what you're doing in training does not apply to real life games, well, it's kind of pointless, isn't it? Now, affordances are basically opportunities. So in football, if you see a gap in defense, I know I'm annoying with football, but it's the one I understand the most. If there's a gap in defense, you're going to take an opportunity to take a shot on goal. Okay, so this is what essentially what they are, opportunities. Lastly, let's look at adaptation. Okay, and this is essentially reorganizing the degrees of freedom, satisfying the ecological constraints or the needs of the competition. So we reorganize the number of different movements needed for a skill. Listen carefully, okay? To end nonlinear pedagogy, let's talk about young athletes. So an athlete that is young and is practicing a lot of different sports, okay, is going to have an easier time in the future uh, when specializing in a certain sport than the athlete that specializes early on, okay? So this is seen through studies according to the sports science IB course, okay? Um, and yeah, essentially, more hours of variety in childhood, the more likely one is to be an expert later on when specializing. Okay, so uh, the best athletes practiced a lot of sports when they were young and then became the best at a certain thing compared to those that were doing only one sport their whole childhood. That ends nonlinear pedagogy. Let's have a look at the next topic following attention, where we'll see that there are three types of attention. There's concentration, selective attention that we've looked at, and divided attention, which is essentially multitasking. Let's have a look at this now. Attention can be external or internal. This involves external being opponents, okay, and internal, for example, the thoughts or feelings that you're having. Now, it can also be broad or narrow. Broad is when you're focusing on different things at the same time. This is divided attention, or narrow, where you're focusing on one or two things at most. Now, we can have in betweens. We can have broad and external attention where you're focusing on a lot of external things, maybe a lot of opponents at the same time, or the ball and a lot of opponents, anything that's external. Now, we can also have external or narrow, where you're focusing on one external thing, and then one internal narrow, and you get what I'm saying. Now, let's look at internal and external distractors. So we've got external distractors being things such as worrying about the coach's opinion, that's mental, emotional distractors, anger, or physical distractors like this physical discomforts. Internal distractors, okay, so this is things that you can hear and you can see. Now, let's look at controlled distraction techniques. There's 5, and there is a lot of writing for this, so I'm sorry. There's performance goals, okay, uh, where you're focused on a certain objective. So essentially, this is where you focus on a specific goal. This is where you choose what to focus on, okay? This is when you repeat words to yourself to either motivate yourself or keep concentrated. We're going to look at this deeper down the line. Then there's the routines, okay? So, for example, uh, before shooting in golf, the golfer is always going to take a deep breath, and he's going to do that every single time. Or, for example, when you see a bodybuilder lifting a lot of weight, he'll make like gorilla noises or something to pump himself up. Okay, so that's a routine that he's going to do every time he's about to lift or he's about to hit the golf ball. Okay, and then there's mental practice where you visualize the outcome that you want. So you'll see Michael Jordan visualizing the successful dunk, okay, and that helps him actually achieve it. Let's have a look at arousal, okay, and compare it to performance. We can have low arousal, medium arousal, or very high arousal, and let's see how it impacts performance in different types of sports. So starting with team sports, we're gonna want to have a medium level of arousal. Arousal being like the excitement how emotional the situation is, okay? So for team sports, we don't want the arousal to be too high, okay? Because then we can't focus on team tactics, but we don't want it to be too low because then we can't perform physically, if that makes sense. Now, calm sports, it's less about the physical and more about the concentration, and so we're going to want to have less arousal. We don't want the arousal to be too low either, because then we can't even focus on the golf, but we don't want it to be high, certainly not. Now, for intense sports, it's going to be the opposite. We're going to want to have a lot of emotion, um, arousal, perhaps rage to help us lift. We don't really need the lower arousal in order for us to think. Now, let's look at arousal and attention. So we'll see that, uh, so starting with attention, we'll see that this represents narrow attention, focusing on one thing or two, and broad attention, focusing on a lot. So if we're focusing on a lot of things at the same time, okay, because the arousal is low, when your arousal is low, you can focus on a lot of things, right? This involves too many distractions. Now, when your arousal is very high and you're only focused on one thing, okay, you can't divide attention. Remember, dividing attention is like multitasking. So, for example, if you're very angry at uh, this one player and you're just focused on him, you won't be able to focus on the game, okay? So, you want to have the in between, the balance that allows the highest performance. Moving on to self-talk, okay? There's three types. We're going to see the attentional switching type, the motivational self-talk, and the instructional self-talk. Attentional switching involves switching from one task to another by instructing yourself. So first, this hockey player is going to be like, oh, I need to find space immediately to now shoot. Motivational, it is what it sounds like. I can do this. Uh, I can score, stuff like that. Motivational. And instructional, watch the ball. Pretty straightforward. To end the video, types of transfer. This is actually in the 10-hour topic. I just forgot to put it until now. So skill to skill transfer. When improving in one skill improves another. This is basically same as positive transfer. Um, practice to performance. So how practicing and training is going to help you in the real game. Abilities to skills. How training your muscles or your endurance. How physical training is going to help you in other skills. Okay. Bilateral transfers. So when you improve both sides, improving your weaker foot, your weaker arm. And then there's stage to stage. So 3-on-3 in basketball to a full game, or 7-on-7 in football to a full game. And lastly, principles to skills. So perhaps if we're using physics and we look at fluid mechanics, okay, we'll see that the optimal angle at which to throw something at ground level is 45 degrees, okay? And you can do this with any principle really, as long as you can apply it to a real sport.